that. There's quite a lot of things in there where they're being nudged. We're all nudged throughout our life to certain choices. We don't have to accept the nudge. But then would you accept that women have lacked opportunities, that they've lacked, the nudge has not operated in the same way? So for you to say, end up...
Over what time span?
Well, you can choose your time span, say 100 years if you like.
I would
don't
say
really mind the time span. The point is, are women, in a sense, already going through a number of gates in life, and some of them are wider than others?
It's complicated. I mean, I think men were directed down narrow pathways in ways that women weren't. So, for example, they were much more likely to be conscripted into wars, for example, which actually happens to be a non-trivial phenomena because it resulted in the deaths and the demolition of many men. And so both sexes are subject to the arbitrary strictures of culture. And perhaps you could argue that women had the worst time of it, although it's not that easy an argument to make. I would say that the extra pressures of child-rearing and the inevitability of pregnancy played a very large role in that, and we didn't deal with that effectively till 1960. And so one of the things that I really don't like about the women were oppressed by men throughout history narrative is the fact that both men and women were terribly oppressed by nature throughout history, and that's not being factored into the equation. And I think that what men and women did for most of history, the decent ones anyways, was team up and partner up and try to make life the least amount of miserable for both. And yet we read this narrative backwards and we say, well, the reason that men and women weren't operating equally in the sociocultural landscape was because men were oppressing them. It's like, sorry, no. That accounts for a tiny fraction of it, or some proportion of it. But it had much more to do with the fact that everyone was poor and miserable, and that women were locked into a reproductive cycle from which they had no practical escape. We didn't fix that till the 60s.
What might irritate some working women, indeed some women, whether they work or not, is you can either sort of look at something like the gender pay gap and sort of pick apart how difficult it is, or you could say, well, let's try to fix this, and let's have an intelligent argument about how we best fix this thing. And the argument that women are self-selecting out of the workplace becomes a bit of a roadblock.
Yeah, but women do self-select out of the workplace all the time. Well, if you look at the legal profession, that's absolutely crystal clear. Women are overrepresented at the lower ends of the legal profession, but they stop operating at the high ends in their 30s, and it happens in all sorts of professions. And there's good reason for it.
What reason being?
Well, because women in their late 20s tend to decide that they don't want to work 80 hours a week. They would rather have a family and devote some time to that, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to do.
Another possibly reasonable thing to do is for the child-rearing roles of men and women to come more into balance than allowing, with some trade-offs, life being imperfect, allowing women to come back earlier into the workforce.
Well, yes, but that also assumes that what women want to do is come back. That's never the argument
that you put. You put it on the women.
Well, no, not at all. That's not a fair characterization in the least. Your argument is predicated on the idea that the advantage to women is in coming back to the workplace. But many women decide, especially once they have children, that having their children and spending time with them is actually more valuable than going back to the workplace. And that's a reasonable thing to decide. In fact, you might think it's the intelligent thing to decide.
Well, a lot of people do then come back into the workforce, and their pay is then lower.
Well, that's something that you had mentioned earlier, and the fact that women pay a disproportionate price with regards to long-term career earnings if they become mothers. That's a very narrowly focused problem, and it's a problem that might need to be addressed. But that's not the same as the gender pay gap. It's a much more defined problem.
Yes,
and part of the problem is, how do we best...
Can we get you to carry a banner for that part of the feminist crusade then?
Not if it's part of the feminist crusade, no. Because that would mean I'd have to carry a banner for what I regard as a rather reprehensible ideology. But I do...
Overall, feminism is a reprehensible ideology?
Well, what percentage of British women regard themselves as feminists now?
I don't know.
7%.
Well, it depends how you ask a question, I would guess.
Well, no, the reasonable measurements of it estimate there's something like that. It's a very small percentage.
Really?
Yes, really.
Well,
it's a very small minority, even if it's not 7%. And part of the reason for that is...
Would that make it inherently wrong? I mean, I'm not sure it's 7%. And, but I think that's one on which we could all go and bandy a bit of research on the isms. But would it necessarily be such a bad idea? I mean, you must have sometimes stuck up for minority rights, even if the idea is right.
Of all,
as you say in your book,
women aren't a minority, by the way. They're
Indeed.
actually a majority.
Precisely so. So in
Right,
that
so
sense,
they're not minority rights that we're talking about here if we're talking about female rights. Have I stuck up for minority rights?
Yes.
I don't see the world
well, you've
from
said
that
the
perspective.
7% example would suggest that even a small group within women thought that feminism was, you just decide yourself whether feminism's a good thing or not. It doesn't really matter.
Well, I think it's not a good thing because it plays identity politics games, and I'm not a fan of identity politics games and the collectivist viewpoint. I don't think that men should be set against women. I don't think that we should view the world as a competition between men and women. I don't think we should view history as a structure that pitted oppressed women against the oppressor men. I don't like that story. I think it's a nasty story, and I think it's designed. It's destined to divide us in ways that will not be good. I think it's a story fundamentally predicated on resentment. I don't think it's an accurate view of the way things unfolded in the past. And I don't think women were as powerless or as unable to contribute as the feminists claim they were before, like 1960.
But earlier you thought that things did come into balance for women in the 60s. So something changed.
I thought,
something was good about the 60s, yes?
I thought that the birth control pill was invented. And the reason that women have far more flexibility, let's say, in their lives now is fundamentally because they have more control over their reproductive status. And that never really happened until the 1960s.
Yes, but they may have built other conclusions on that other than that, great, I can control my fertility. It's great, I can control my fertility. Now what is the question that we're tussling with?
Well, that is, but that's exactly it. That is precisely the question that we're dealing with. But the causal order of that is, oh, now I can control my fertility. Now what? That's a biological revolution.
But that has consequences for men as well as women, right?
Of course it does.
Good.
And there are consequences.
So what do men have to change? We've had a lot of focus here on how women have had it better than that perhaps you think that modern feminists think they have.
I don't know.
Do men need to change?
I don't know if women had it better than modern feminists think they had it. I think that if women had it hard in the past, which they certainly do, that the amount of that was attributable to male oppression is far smaller than the feminists claim, because nature had her hand in that. You know, the average person in the Western world in 1895 lived on less than $1 a day in today's money. That's below the UN guidelines for poverty. So life was very hard for men and women for almost all of human history. And to view that as part of an oppression narrative on the part of men, I think, is one of the things that is very hard on young men, for example, when they're trying to take their place in the world. So how would men have to change because women have control over the reproductive function? That's an open-ended question. I don't know. Casual sex is much more available than it used to be. That's one way that men have been able to change. They haven't had to take on responsibility for adopting a long-term monogamous relationship in order to get sexual access. So that's a big change. It's also enabled men to not grow up to quite a great degree.
I'm not sure if you're welcoming that or
I'm not saying it's a good thing. It is very complicated.
So movements that bring that whole difficulty of the mating game or the hookup culture into the debate must therefore be a good thing, and presumably you would also I shouldn't use the word presumably, but would you welcome that?
I think there's very little good about the hookup culture. I think there's very little good about casual sexual relationships. I don't think they're good for men or for women.